Good evening, everyone. And tonight we are going to be talking about prayer in the ancient Near East and in Israel. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually, my assumption that we are going to talk about biblical prayer, but my assumption is that everyone here is pretty familiar with biblical prayer, so that we're not going to I would love, guys, I would love to just do a class just on biblical prayer, because we're doing ancient Near East in the Bible, and I don't want people to get angry at me. We're really going to do a lot of stuff on the ancient Near East. I will be putting it up on the screen as I read it. Okay, so you don't have to go looking through source sheets or anything like that. I am I believe everything or nearly everything I reference is going to be in your source sheets. And what we're going to be doing, in case you couldn't tell, is we're going to be looking at prayers from different places and different periods, just to kind of get a sense of the range that we have in prayer, so we can talk about what makes biblical prayer unique to the extent that it is unique, and what we can find in a broader milieu, and also how this kind of reflects on both kind of the special nature of biblical prayer and the human condition, which I think is an interesting issue in its own right. Okay, so let's start. Let's actually, you know what? Let's start with a quick look at what it means to, we don't have a lot of prayer in narrative in the ancient Near East, but we do have it. And the truth is that there are a lot of incantations also that are embedded in narrative. So it's not like it's completely foreign. So let's take a quick look at an example, and that's going to be at the very end of your handout. I'm going to open it up on my side, and hang on, I'm going to share my screen first. Let's share my screen. Here we are. Okay, here we go. Oh, here we go. And not this. Okay, and let's go here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go to, well, okay, here. So at the very end of your handouts, let me minimize this. At the very end of your handouts, you will see a piece from Pritchard from Annette, and it's a little piece of Gilgamesh, just because I wanted to show you some prayer embedded in narrative. All right, so let's take a quick look. So here, Gilgamesh is talking to the elders, and the elders say, "May thy God protect thee. May he lead thee on the road back in safety," or I should say, he lead you to the land, on the road back in safety to the landing place at Uruk. May he bring you back. Gilgamesh kneels down before Shamash, the words which he speaks. "I go, O Shamash, my hands raised up in prayer. May it henceforth be well with my soul. Bring me back to the landing place at Uruk. Establish over me thy protection." Gilgamesh called his friend and inspected his own. So here we actually see a place where, in fact, the hero is expected to be able to kneel down and go and pray to God. Now, there's an idea, and now I'm going to go to some biblical texts. There's a very nice series of lectures that Moshe Greenberg gave, and that are written up in a book. And what you'll see, what he says is that if you look at, let me stop sharing for a second. If you look at the biblical text there, and with the biblical narrative, it's very common for character. Let's talk about it as a narrative, right? It's very common for characters to turn to God in prayer, and their prayer matches their personalities and who they are, their character. All right. So let's take a quick let's look at an example. So here, if we take a look at here, I am in Brachit in Genesis. I am this is actually, the first part is really not a prayer. The first thing I'm going to show you, it's more kind of it's a vow. So it's a little bit, it's kind of different. It's just to call it a prayer is pushing it. All right. But here we are, we're in Perek Chavchet, chapter 28 of Breshit, of Genesis. All right. And this is when Yaakov goes to sleep in Bethel, and he wakes up after his dream, and he says, Yaakov Yaakov awakened from his sleep, and he said, surely God is in this place, and I did not know. And I did not know. And he's awed by the place. And then he says, he makes a vow in verse 20 in Pasuk Chaf. He says, let me again use my little lighter. There we go. Vayidar Yaakov neder lemor, and Yaakov made a vow saying, Vayidar Yaakov neder lemor, im yeh Elohim imadi, ushmarani baderech hazer asher anochi holech, v'natani lechem lechol uvel gidl bosh. If God is with me, and he keeps me on this path that I am walking on, and he gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, v'shevti b'shalom, and I return in peace, el beit avi, to the house of my father, v'yadonai li lelohim. And then God is going to be my God. The Lord is going to be my God. And that kind of deal, which is kind of a weird, we would normally think, frankly, in a more of an ancient Near Eastern context, it's not such a weird deal to make. We'll see this sort of interaction in broader ancient Near Eastern prayer, where they're saying, hey, we brought you this, gods, and we brought you that, and now you owe us, kind of thing. Now, this is a little bit different. This is, if God does this for me, then I will worship him without any specific, and then what does that mean? V'ha'even hazot asher santi matzeva yeh bet Elohim. Right? I'm going to make this place, which meanwhile I have made a matzeva, I'm going to make it into a temple. V'chol asher titenli aser asrenu lach. And whatever you give me, I will give a tithe, right? I will give a tenth to you. So this is a promise of worship. So it's interesting. It's kind of the opposite of what I've seen in some other ancient Near Eastern stuff, where they say, I brought these sacrifices, whatever the God is, God, now give me stuff, right? And he's like saying, if you give me stuff, I will make this into a temple. It's pretty basic stuff, right? You can understand why this is something that Yaakov feels he needs to make a deal for, but it's kind of a deal. Let's take a look at what happens when he actually comes back. And this is right when I have these kind of controls in the way. So I'm going to move another way. All right. This is when Yaakov is about to meet Esav, and he is scared, right? So first things first, he sends messengers, and then they say he's coming. So he's very scared. He separates everyone into two camps. And with a strategic mind, right? If Esav kills one of them, at least he'll have the other one left. And then he prays, right? And what does he say? Vayomer Yaakov Elohei Avi Avraham Elohei Avi Yitzchak Adonai Haomer Elai Shuv La'artzecha Ulemoladetecha Ve'etiva Imach. And Yaakov said, God, the God of my father Abraham and the God of my father Yitzchak, the Lord who says to me, go back to your land and your birthplace, and I will do well with you, right? Or will do good for you. In other words, he's already starting with the assumption, like, God, you promised that this move back to the land of Canaan is going to be good for me, and that you're going to do good things for me. And here I am, possibly coming to an armed conflict, because Esav has not liked me for quite a while. Okay. Katonti mikol chasadim umikol ha'emet asher asita et abdecha ki v'makli avarti et hayarden hazeh v'ata hayiti l'shnei machanot. I am too small from all of the kindness and from all the truth that you, or really here, not truth, but faithfulness, right? Kind of God has kept faith with me. He and so that you did for your servant, because I crossed the Jordan with only my stick, and now I have become two camps. And this is using, of course, the strategic move of splitting it into two camps to say, well, this is not just because I'm scared, it's because I'm so numerous and God has made me so numerous. So here we have, starting with, God, you promised that you would do good for me. And then he's like, you have done good for me. I am not worthy, But now, please, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav. Now save me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esav. Ki yareh anochi oto pen yavo vikani em al banim. I am scared lest he come and smite me, a mother with the children, smite me and my wives and my children. Vata marta heteviti etivimach. And you said, I'm going to do good for you. And I'm going to make your offspring like the sand of the sea that can't be counted because it's so much, right? So what's the idea? The idea is, God, you promised, right? There's this basic idea here that Yaakov is saying, yeah, Yaakov's asking for something. He's saying, I'm too small for everything wonderful you've done for me, God. But God, you promised. So we see in both of them that Yaakov is thinking this through. He's trying to say a prayer that will convince God, quote unquote, to help him. Okay, and that's Yaakov's personality. Yaakov is used to kind of negotiating situations, right? We see that throughout his life, that this is what Yaakov does, and this is how Yaakov prays. Okay, now let's compare that to Shimshon. Okay, again, this is not my idea. This is Moshe Greenberg's idea. Okay, so let's compare this to Shimshon. Okay, here we have Shimshon. This is actually, I think, a very powerful prayer, simple but powerful. Okay, here he is. Shimshon has been blinded and is now essentially a clown for the Philistines' amusement. And they bring him into a place that's filled with people. Okay, it has about 3,000 people there, which is unbelievable, right? It's a pretty large amount for the time, and they want to all kind of laugh at Shimshon and find him amusing. All right. Vayikra Shimshon. I'm just going to read the whole thing out. Vayikra Shimshon el Adonai. Here I'm gonna. I should have done that, but I'm gonna put. Here we are. Okay, from the beginning. Vayikra Shimshon el Adonai vayomar Adonai Elohim zachreni na v'chazkeni na achapam hazeh haElohim v'inakma nekam achat mishtei einai miplishtim. And Shimshon calls to God, to Lord, and he says, my master, Lord, remember me and strengthen me this time as well, God. And I will take revenge once. I will take one vengeance for my 2 eyes from the Philistines. Okay. So here he is. He's completely powerless. And he says he has this history of God giving him this inhuman strength, right? Shimshon has this history of having this inhuman strength, this divine strength. That's a very big part of Shimshon's story, that he misuses his divine strength because he uses it to escape. He uses it to escape when he's caught in like a house of ill repute and stuff like that. But he's been given this divine strength, and he says, God, give me strength one more time that I can take one vengeance for my 2 eyes. Okay, just that one line. There's no wheeling dealing. There's no you promised. There's no you gave me the strength for a reason. There's no I'm doing this for the greater nation. Let me take vengeance for my 2 eyes from these people. Give me strength one more time, right? And as Moshe Greenberg points out, these prayers reflect the characters of the people who are speaking them. Unlike liturgical prayers where they're composed and everyone says the same thing, these are meant to be heartfelt prayers that individuals are saying to God. And Moshe Greenberg says what the Bible's reflecting here is this idea that any member of the Jewish people or of Am Yisrael, the Israelite people, any member can turn to God with a prayer. Anyone can turn to God in his own words and speak a prayer and be listened to. And everyone has that personal relationship with God. Now, this is clearly true in the Bible. Also, I would like to point out also, of course, that the Bible has characters that act differently from each other, that are very different and that develop over time. I feel like even with Yaakov, I think we see a development between his first vow and his next prayer, where the first vow is very much seeing himself, just his individual needs, and he's like says to God, he's not connected to any sort of history, he's not connecting it to his forefathers. He's like, God, if you give me stuff, you'll be my God, right? Whereas the second time, when he's praying in the face of Asaph, he's like, you're the God of my father, you're God of my grandfather. You promise things are going to be good. And he's connecting himself to this history. And that's why I'm asking you to help me now. Okay, so you see a development even in that narrative, as in the, if you know, in the essay Odysseus' Scar, I'm sorry I forgot the author, but of course it's a very famous essay. In the essay Odysseus' Scar, the author compares biblical narrative and Homer, right? If any of you have read the Odyssey, right? I'm thinking of a joke, actually, if I could just want to tell a joke. So there's did you see this? It was kind of running around the internet, where the sailor says, where Odysseus is like, we're going on an Odyssey. And the sailor says, what's that? And he says, it's a trip named after the only person who survives. And the sailor's like, oh, wait, what? But anyway, so Odysseus, he goes on, he has a 30-year trip home, right? And he doesn't change. He doesn't age. He stays the same, completely the same. So from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip, he's the same. His character is the same. There's no character development whatsoever. He doesn't age. He stays pretty much like a young, virile 30-year-old, something like that, for the 30 years. Like, there's no aging whatsoever. The only thing that does is things happen to him, right? But he doesn't develop. Whereas Yaakov, he starts out as this young, fearful man. He becomes a mature individual. And then when he goes to Egypt, he's this crotchety old man, right? Right? Loud. My years have been like lousy and few, right? Right? That's what you're saying to the king of Egypt. You're complaining about how old you are and that your years have been yucky. But yeah, he's this crotchety old man now. So you see this development in Yaakov. Similarly, in biblical narrative, we see real differences in people and also in the way that they pray. Now, it's harder to see that in ancient Near Eastern prayer because, frankly, we don't have that much in terms of big blocks of narrative with different characters who pray in different ways. They pray fairly, you get either short prayer or you get kind of liturgical prayers. Let's take a look at some of the prayers, though, that we do see. Okay, so we're leaving narrative now, and we're going to take a look at some ancient Near Eastern prayers. I'm going to pause because I see that there's a question or a comment. Okay, from Susan Aronoff, to try to put Jacob at Bethel in a better light. Okay, so maybe Yaakov said he would worship God if God gave him food and clothing and brought him back in peace, because Yaakov was fearful and thought he might not survive. No, that is clearly the case, yes. He therefore asked for just the basics to survive, and then he would worship God. That is true, exactly. And that's very much Yaakov. In other words, Yaakov is like, this is what I need to survive now. I will do what I need to do to get it, right? He has this deal with Lavan, and the deal is going to mean that he has a deal with Lavan, so how is he still going to be able to have a flock of his own? So he does what he needs to do. Like, that's very much Yaakov. He makes the deals he needs to make. So that's, so yes, it's very, very clear from his initial vow that he's asking for the basic minimum he needs to survive. He's asking for survival. He's like, God, if you help me survive, I will make this place a temple and I will tithe everything. Okay, absolutely. Any further questions before we move on? Okay. Let's see. By the way, when I share my screen, can you also see me, or you just see my screen? You see me also?
We see you too.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, so I will now share my screen, and we will go into so now we're going into the source sheet. Here we go. Okay. Oh. Can everyone see the source sheets on my screen? Someone needs to unmute themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, terrific. So let's let's go. Let's take a quick look at some Egyptian. We have a pretty nice range of Egyptian hymns. Some of the hymns now, actually, what I brought. I'm wondering now if I should actually start with some other ones. Well, let's go in order. So here, so what kind of we have actually. I'm gonna stop this here for a second. What we have actually, this is also important, is when we talk about prayer. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of prayer. So we have the kind of, let's call it kind of spontaneous prayer or personal prayer that we see in biblical narrative, right? That we see when you have a narrative. Okay, now not always. So for example, Hannah's prayer, Yonah's prayer, those prayers are really look like they come straight from a Mizmor Tehillim, straight from a psalm, right? They look like a psalm. They're structured that way. And so those don't seem to be personal outcryings. They seem to be kind of more stylized prayers that are being put into the mouth of the main character, right? So it's like I as much as you want to say, like Hannah, I think it's great the way she's portrayed, and she's dealing with childlessness, and I think that's but most women, I think when they talk about having a child, they're not going to use military terms. They're generally not going to use military terms in terms of winning over an enemy. It's usually not how they're going to describe it. Yonah's prayer actually is really nice because it does reflect the switch that you have in the narrative from Yonah being completely closed in and silent and he's running from God to Yonah obeying God, to Yonah, right? And you have that switch within the prayer that's in the middle of Yonah, that within the excuse me, that within the narrative of Yonah, it's in the belly of the fish, right? He prays. And that in that prayer, you actually have this feeling of I'm sinking, and then God, you save me. Then there's this kind of switch in the prayer itself with a reconnection to God. And so that that prayer and the prayer that prayer, there's a theory that the prayer that you read in Yonah would have been possible a prayer that sailors would have said. When they were at sea and worried about, saying, God, let me reach shore safely, right? Perhaps, because it uses a lot of water metaphors, obviously. So moving, but now, so we have kind of personal prayers that seem spontaneous or semi-spontaneous. There are prayers that seem more stylized, like Psalms, right? Tehillim is like the classic example of something where it's written to be a prayer, and everyone's going to say the same prayer, even if it's based on a personal experience, right? So you have a lot of prayers, a lot of Tehillim, which are talking about everyone, a false testimony. False testimony is one of the things that the psalmist complains about a ton, and you can absolutely understand why in the ancient world this would be a real problem. If you have someone who is, if you have people who are testifying against you, and that's all you've got, there is no CSI. No one's dusting for fingerprints. You have 3 people coming, or 4 people, or 2 people, or however many people saying, I saw him do this, right? You are in big trouble. You are in big trouble. So false testimony is a real problem, and that's one of the themes that you can see repeating in the Psalms, for example. However, they're still very stylized, and you can see that they are written, they're composed as poems that are meant to be recited. Okay, so most of the prayers we're going to be looking at now are like that. Excuse me. Besides, let me just okay. Then there are personal prayers. There are stylized liturgical prayers, and those prayers that are meant to be recited frequently in groups, not always, but frequently in groups. And then there are incantations. And incantations are something else, because incantations are where someone kind of wants to reach up into heaven and switch things around and get the gods to do what he needs them to do, right? Kind of go, shoo, 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 shoo. I'm doing this to kind of, shoo. Now everything's going to work, right? And the snakes are going to get out of my house, right? Like that. So that's a little bit different from a prayer. Sometimes there's a fine line. sometimes there really is a fine line between, is this a prayer? Is this an incantation? I know that when you look at Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the things you say, one of the proposed things, which I like actually, is if you address God directly and say, please do this, it's a prayer. If you are saying, demon, God is going to get, by the name of God, and I'm inciting the name of God, and you're using God as, or gods, or whatever, against the force, then it's an incantation. You're not saying, please God help me. You're rather kind of externally using that, trying to use that force against demons. You have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you really do have situations where people are invoking the name of God to scare the demon. Okay, by God, I mean Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? They're using the Tetragrammaton to scare the demon, all right? As opposed to a prayer where they say, God, please help me. Now, there is a fine line, okay? Plenty of times they're saying, oh, God, please help me against these demons, right? And then there are things that are very clear. You have in rabbinic texts, you have in demon bowls, you have divorces of demons, right? I'm divorcing this demon. So you have a get of the demon. And then, it's very clearly not a prayer. Yes, it's a get, it's a divorce. And it's written like a get. And I think the get, there's at least one get of a female demon, like a demon couple, right? And you're divorcing them. Why would you use a get? I assume because if you want to get, you're like, okay, this is a thing that's connected to me and I want it out of my house. What's the model I'm going to use? Well, a divorce. A divorce is going to get an entity who is close to me out of my house. You are no longer connected to me, and get out. So there are absolutely divorces of demons, but that's much later. That's like early medieval. You're talking demon bowls, so that's much later.
Well, contemporary Jewish prayer is,
yes.
I mean, there are prayers where you ask God, and there are prayers where you're just trying to get close to God. Hitbodedut, I guess you call it. But one could see Hitbodedut as perhaps as you obtaining that divine energy. So,
well, you know what? I hear what you're saying, and there's a whole realm of kind of spirituality these days, which I think was much less of no one even thought that way in the ancient years. Now, in the Second Temple period, in the Persian period, the Second Temple period, there is this mystical thing where you want to feel this kind of this feeling of, like in the Qumran, praying with the angels. I've been raised to be among the angels. You absolutely have that. But in the ancient Near East, like in the period of the Hebrew Bible, that's less of a thing that anyone kind of expects or wants. But there is, later on, there is this idea, and then it's much more, but it's really not an incantation. It's more like I'm praying to God with these angels, and in the Hodayot, which is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Hodayot, he's like thanking God for raising me to be among these angels, right? There's a lot of more, you could call it mystical movements, something that you could actually think of as a movement towards almost mysticism once we get into the Second Temple period. So even in narrative texts where you're supposed to kind of read it and in parallel with the main character, kind of feel the strength of the revelation, right? And that's supposed to solve things for you, apparently. That's what it seems like. So if we continue on to, so let's continue on to some of the texts I brought to you. I brought you some stuff from Egypt. I brought you some stuff from Ugarit, and I brought you some things from Babylonia. Oh, and from Hatti. So we have plenty of stuff to look at, and I'm gonna kind of pick and choose. We're gonna do it relatively quickly. I'm not gonna go deep into the weeds with these. I'm gonna share my screen now, and we will look at them. There we go. Okay, so here we are. This is the Cairo hymn of praise to Amun-Re. These are more parallel. Actually, I'm going to have to stop my share because I want to share my entire screen. There we we go, so that I can switch back and forth. If we take a look, I'm going to show you now in Tehillim. So let's take this. Okay, so classically, Brachinosis is a classic example of this. Here we have a psalm talking about the greatness of God, just the greatness of God. And we're talking about the greatness of God in terms of the creation of the earth and the power, more the power over the earth, continuous power over the earth. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down, right? Hamishalech Mayanim, you send forth springs, and you yashku kochot chaitos sada, you give drink to all the animals of the field, right? You support all the animals, all the birds, etc. And we can see this sort of prayer in a way in terms of some prayers that we have in Egypt, and not just Egypt. Obviously, you would understand why you would have these prayers saying how great the God is. So here's a classic one of Amun-Re. The good God, the beloved, who gives life to every warm being and to every good herd. So here we have giving life to everything. And note, I want you to note here, because later on we're going to look again at the hymn to the Aten that's under Akhenaten. Now, Amun-Re is, of course, is the head of, he's the chief of all gods, and Amun-Re was in general considered kind of the head god for quite a while, right? So you have this hymn to Amun-Re, and it doesn't, but realize this is in a polytheistic context, and yet it reads a lot like a hymn to, a monotheistic hymn. You could say, well, unique one like whom among the gods, but we say that too, right? Who is like you among the Elim, right? That's what we say. Here we have unique one like whom among the gods, goodly bull of the Nia, chief of all the gods, father of the gods. So here you see the clearly polytheistic description, but who made mankind, who created the flocks, Lord of what exists, who created the tree of life, who made the herbage, who vivifies the herd. And it's similarly describing how he created the earth, how Amun-Re created the earth, how, and in particular, how he's connected to Egypt, right? Who made the common man, who distinguished their forms, who made their lives, who separated the races one from another. That's actually very interesting, because we have that more maybe in Dvarim, in Hazinu, who rescues the fearful from the hand of the brazen, who judges the wretched in the ruins. And this sounds very similar to kind of any sort of praise of God. Again, we're talking about within the context of the world. And I wanted to show this to you first because here, if I move down, we have the great hymn to the Aten. Now, the great hymn to the Aten, people right away wanted to compare it to Brachinosis, to the psalm I was showing you earlier. Here we are. I forget that it's Kuf Dalet, it's 104, right? So I just think of it as Brachinosis. But if we go back, this is when they found the great hymn to the Aten. This was one of the things where they really wanted to compare it to that psalm. And here you have different different comparisons to specific verses in Brachinosis in Psalm 104. Why did they automatically, first of all, yes, there are certain, I find, because notice they go 20, 23, 12, 25, 26. Okay, all right. So it's a little bit, there are certain comparisons that you can make. One of the reasons that they really, if you look at how far these comparisons are from each other, if you can see that this is B, so this is where they're seeing a comparison to Pasuk Chaf, to verse 20. Okay, this is B, and then you have C over here, right? And they're looking to Chaf Gimel to 23. So and they're and they're all very basic things that you would expect. The entire land sets out to work. All beasts browse on their herbs. Yeah, that the whole land works. So if you look, here it is, 23. Let's look at our comparison here, 23. Yetzei Adam l'fa'alo. Yeah, man goes forth to work, v'la'avoto adei arev, and to his labor unto the evening. So yeah, it's a parallel thing, but it's not necessarily the entire land sets out to work. It's similar, yeah. I mean, sure. So you can absolutely find comparisons, but then the question becomes: is this more of a poetic standard? However, what is interesting, of course, and the reason that people really get into it is because the Aten. If anyone remembers with Akhenaten, what was special about the king Akhenaten and his worship of the Aten, the sun disk? What was special?
He was a monotheist.
Right. He was a monotheist. Some people would say he was a henotheist, but he created this worship of this one God, the Aten. And he specifically said that Aten is the only God, even though he cut off the Theban priests, but he didn't cut off all the priests in the more far-flung areas. So he wasn't quite that strict. And also, of course, in general, the way he created the mythology of it, he and his wife Nefertiti, they worshiped the Aten, and everyone else was supposed to worship them. However, we do see from the tombs that people did worship the Aten directly. And as I mentioned when we had our class on Akhenaten, what's especially fascinating is not just the fact that he chose the Aten to be his god, because you could say, well, Amun-Re was almost, we've just read a hymn to the Amun-Re, could very easily be seen as like the god. You already had Amun-Re being kind of portrayed as the main god. And Amun-Re, of course, by creating this worship of the Aten, he could take the power center away from Thebes, right? Which is something that he clearly wanted to do. But the Aten itself was so abstract, right? What you have is this sun disk, right? Where before every single god is a personified something, right? Or it's some animal. The Aten is this circle. It's a circle, and out of it are like these arms that are giving life and health, etc. Like these kind of thin little arms. But the Aten itself is just a circle. It's really something that's very, very abstract. And the real question is did he arrive at this from Semitic influences? I mean, from my point of view, the monotheism, I feel like he could have even reached himself just in terms of wanting to kind of get all the power back. But the abstraction of it, and to expect people to worship an abstract God, that I think is a tremendous leap. And so here we have in the great hymn to the Aten, we're looking at essentially a monotheistic hymn, right? And so it's very natural to look and say, oh, is this language that he's using? First of all, is there a connection between Psalm 104, Brachinosis, and this, and by the way, there are those who think that it went the other way. In other words, who feel that there was a core of Brachinosis that influenced this rather than the other way around. But of course, most people are going to want to find the influence in the other direction, right? From the hymn to the Aten to Brachinosis. But here we have this description of a single God, creator of life, filling every land with your beauty. You are beauteous, great, and radiant. And here, if we look at Brachinosis, right? Ote orka salman, ote shamayim kayiriah. Here we are, hod v'adar lavashta. You're clothed in glory and majesty. You're covering yourself in light like a garment. You spread the heaven like a curtain. And this similar. So you have similar language, and then the idea of everyone working. Now here it makes the idea is that everyone's working because of the sun, right? The sun, because remember the Aten is not just a circle. The Aten is the sun disk. All right. So because of the sun, everyone is alive. Where if we look at Brachinosis, and we see the idea that you also made the moon, right? You made the moon for seasons. Shemesh yadam avo. Oh, the sun knows when it sets, right? You made darkness and it's night, right? And that's when all the nocturnal animals come out, right? So in Brachinosis, there isn't quite the same obvious thing of, well, it's the sun, that's why everyone's going out to work, right? The idea that and we start, and what's interesting is that in terms of the day cycle in Brachinosis, we start with the night, right? We start with the night. You made the moon, you made the sun to know when it sets, right? You make darkness, right? And that's when all the nocturnal animals come out. And then when the sun shines, they go away, they go back to their homes, and the man comes out to work, right? Right? You did, how great are your works, that you did everything with wisdom, that everything has its time and its place, right? And that's one of the emphases of Brachinosis. Now you could say, I mean, you don't have to say it would be because of psalm like this, right? You could say that because people worship the sun, that's a reason to start the psalm with nighttime, right? Start with nighttime to kind of emphasize we're not talking about the sun. We don't worship the sun. We worship the God that's above all of that. I'm going to take a pause here because I think I saw some comments. Let me stop share for a second. Okay, is that the same tree of life from Gan Eden? No, it is not the same tree of life from Gan Eden. Yeah, so we mentioned the tree of life in the when we were reading the Egyptian. I think that was not the Aten, right? That was to Amun Re. It's not the same tree of life that we have in Bereshit, in Genesis. So what we saw there was, we saw what we call kind of like Theophanies, like this idea of God and God's creation and God, what God does. And we saw how it kind of plays out on the one hand in Egypt, on the one hand for Amun-Re, on the other hand for the Aten, right? And the differences, where with the Aten, everything's kind of centered around the sun. And specifically in Psalm 104 in Brachinosis, it actually starts with the moon, right? And starts with nighttime. And the idea is God is so smart, he gave everything kind of its place in this larger world that doesn't just revolve around the sun, as it were, right? That is more than just the sun. So I'm going to pause for a second, take a breath, and to see if anyone has any questions. Any questions? Yes, go ahead, y'all.
Well, no, I'm just comment. People always seem to want to say this influenced that, or no, that influenced that. It doesn't have, like, it could be that like Jung, things arise, human consciousness.
100%. Yes. 100%. 100%. And you could say, look, when you're talking about God or supreme God or whatever, and you want to praise God, how are you going to praise God?
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to praise him? Especially, and I want to remind people, this is something that just to remind you that later on in Second Temple Judaism, we get to more of a thing of talking about the angels and what's going on in the heavens and all this stuff. In this period, no, people aren't thinking about that so much. There can be angels and there can be stuff going on, but it doesn't matter. What matters is what's going on here on earth, right? When I talk about how great God is, what I want to talk about is, I can talk about the angels. He's great because he's got angels. That's great. But I especially want to talk about earth and how God manifests himself on earth, because that's my world. My world is earth. I'm not thinking that my world is the heavens. It's not. It's never gonna be. People aren't really thinking that way, that when they die, they go to heaven. No, when they die, they go down to Sheol, right? The Egyptians get a bit of an afterlife, right? They're like, oh, okay, we're taking our stuff. We're packing up. We've got our servants, right? But the ancient, but in the when especially once you leave Egypt, everyone's going down to Sheol. Everyone's going to be lying there in the mud, and it's not fun, and it's not heavenly, And what I care about is what's going on earth. And so when I praise God, I'm going to praise him for his influence on earth and in the future and past, right? I'm not just going to keep it in my present, but I'm not going to start going into, again, we do have Psalms that talk about angels, right? Especially since there are some Psalms that are clearly later, right? And the dating of the Psalms is, of course, a big issue, but some of them are very clearly later. They place themselves later. And so you have us talking about the angels, but in general, you're always going to be saying, what makes God great? Well, what he does on earth. Okay, so here I have, but Brachinosis also begins with daytime in a sense. It begins with Ota Orka Salma, right? That you wrap the light around you. Yes, and that is actually a heavenly reference. In other words, it's saying that God made the heavens, right? The light comes from God, right? Now, I do think that there's this idea that there also that there's a light beyond the sun. Honestly, like I think that there's an idea there is that God has light, just like God created in Breshit in Genesis, God creates light and dark, right? There's a light and dark beyond the sun that God is in control of, right? And then later on, what does that become in rabbinic thought and in mystical thought, right? That's the primordial light, right? That's the primordial light that the righteous get when they go to heaven. They get the primordial light that existed before the sun. So if we want to connect it to mysticism and that whole thing and all that stuff, it's not even mystic. It's like how was there light before the sun? And the answer that was the primordial light, right? But I think it's true that it does start with light. I think that's more of the idea that God has control of the heavens, because it's right before that he spreads out the heavens like a curtain, right? So moving right along, if there are no other questions, I'm going to share my screen once again.
Miriam.
Yes.
My gut feeling, I'm not sure I have what to base this on, but it's a gut feeling that Brachinosis is a rather of an exception among the Tehillim in being so nature oriented. And because my feeling is that Judaism perhaps is less nature oriented than other religions because of this reticence to invoke the forces of nature, because that could inspire polytheism. And in Judaism, you're trying to deliver the idea that the forces of nature are subservient to God and not the other way around.
That is a good point. That is a good point.
So
a lot of times when we have what we call Theophanies, right? This thing where God comes out. It does talk about God coming out from the heavens and the storms and the mountains, and without going too much into, I guess we could say maybe it's I hear what you're saying, and I don't disagree. Like I'm listening. That the idea that there aren't that many prayers that talk that much about nature. I feel like there's a lot talking about God's power over natural forces within prayer in the context of, and please help me, right? And especially in Psalms, you'll have saying, oh, everything's against me and I don't know what to do. And God, you have so much power. You create mountains. You do this. Help me. Please help me. You come out with your angels, from the heavens. Please help me, right? There's not a lot that is just saying, okay, we're just going to praise God. We do have ones where we praise. I see I'm going to have to pause for a drink. I'm sorry. We do have things where we praise God in history, especially where we praise God through about what he does for a king. But you are right that this kind of intensive praise of God through nature, perhaps, I think we have it a couple other times, something similar. I guess you're right. That's a good point. Is it so that people don't worship nature? I don't know. Here you get very influenced by when you think the Psalms were written, to be perfectly honest. because the later the Psalms were written, the less you'd have that as an issue, to be perfectly honest. The later, if you have Psalms written in like the Second Temple period, or or around then, you're not going to have so much of a problem with people worshiping trees, like, or worshiping like it's not considered a big idol worship is not the big problem in the Second Temple period. It's except when it's being when we're being forced to it, right? But people actually believing in that kind of worship is considered less of a problem than it genuinely is. Even at the end of the First Temple period, right? Jeremiah can talk about it very mockingly. Ha ha ha, they make an idol out of wood, and then what's left they burn in the fireplace and they cook their food on it. Ha 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 ha, how stupid, and they think this thing is a god, and you're supposed to read it and say, ha ha ha, yeah, that's really stupid. When the fact that he can kind of make fun of it that way shows that it's already quite far from the way Judeans think, right? It's not such a threat. It's not such a threat anymore. Okay, so I see where it's almost 9, so I'm going to speed things up. So let's hop around a little bit and look at some other prayers. Sharing my screen. Here we are. Okay, so I wanted to. This is a personal prayer. Okay, this is a personal prayer in also from Egypt. And here it's prayer. Come to me, pray Hatti. Come to me, Atum, every day. You are the noble God. Hear my prayers, my supplications by day, my hymns by night. For my petitions are constant in my mouth; they are heard throughout the day. Okay, pray Hatti, protector of millions, deliverer of hundreds of thousands. Visit not my many offenses upon me. I am one ignorant of himself. I am a mindless man who all day follows his mouth like an ox after grass. Okay, so this is a typical thing. We have it. Carol Newsom, when she was talking about the Hodayot, she called it the Masochistic Sublime. This idea, this is actually not so much the Masochistic Sublime. This is someone who's making himself small in order to say, oh, I am so small, God, I need your help. Now, this is a typical stance in prayer. And it becomes more and more once we get to kind of closer to what we consider an interest in spirituality in the Second Temple period, we have people who are actually they're entering into prayers and they're making themselves small, not just to ask the God for help, but as Carol Newsom pointed out, because they're feeling how great God is. God, you are so amazing. You're so amazing. I am so small and I need your help. And this is what she calls the Masochistic Sublime. I like the idea, I'll say it more slowly, Masochistic Sublime. In other words, you have this feeling of sublime because you're in the presence of God. At the same time, that makes you so small. And it's a perfect stance for prayer because that is when you're asking God for help. Okay. So we see this certainly in Psalms. We see this a lot. We see this to a certain extent. We saw this in Yaakov's prayer. Remember, he said, "Katonti, I am made small by how much you have done for me." Right. So we see this idea of being small in prayer. Here now, what I'm turning to now are the plague prayers of Murshilli II. We've mentioned these prayers before because I mentioned them in the context. We looked at them in the context of Avraham's dialogue with God, or I think it's Avraham's dialogue with God to trying to save Sodom. Okay, and the idea of don't kill the many for the few. Here I want to do something a little bit different. These are king's prayers. Okay, there's a plague and the plague doesn't go away, and you have a succession of kings saying, please stop the plague, and they're trying to do all sorts of things to stop the plague. Okay. I've mentioned it before. It's very interesting. They are able to trace the plague. Like they do think, they do feel like they know where the plague came from. It's not, but at the same time, they figure that they've done some kind of sin, and that's why there's a plague, and they're asking the gods to stop it, right? Here I'm reading if you follow the bouncing red dot here, bouncing, right? Because you, the gods, my lords, have taken vengeance for the blood of Tudaliah. Those who killed Tudaliah have made restitution for the blood. This bloodshed has again ruined Hatti. Hatti has already made sufficient restitution for it. Because I have now come along, I and my household will make restitution for it. Through reparation and propitiatory gift, let the souls of the gods, my lords, again be appeased. May you, the gods, my lords, be well disposed toward me once more. Let me appear before you. May you listen to what I say to you. I have not done anything evil. Of those who sinned and did do evil, not one is still here today. They all died off previously. But because the affair implicating my father has devolved upon me, on behalf of the land I am now giving to you, the gods, my lords, a propitiatory gift on account of the plague. I am making restitution. I am making restitution to you with propitiatory gift and reparation. May you, the gods, my lords, be well disposed toward me once more. Let me appear before you, because Hatti has been oppressed, or I should say Hatti has been oppressed by the plague. Who's been diminished. So what is the idea? The idea is, listen, a bad thing happened. It's been taken care of. I'm bringing you gifts. Everyone who did it has died. We haven't done anything bad. I'm bringing you gifts. Please stop. I'm bringing you gifts, right? The idea is this is almost not a prayer. It's almost just saying, look, I've done everything I could do. I've done this and that and the other. That's how these prayers go on. Here, O storm god of Hatti, my lord, and gods, my lords, so it happens. People always sin. My father sinned and transgressed the word of the storm god of Hatti, my lord. But I did not sin in any way. But so it happens. The sin of the father devolves upon his son. The sin of my father has devolved upon me, and I have now confessed it to the storm god of Hatti, my lord, and to the gods, my lord. It is true. We have done it. Because I have confessed the sin of my father, let the souls of the storm god of Hatti, my lord, and of the gods, my lords, again be appeased. He's trying everything. You really feel for this guy. He is trying everything. He is saying, look, please, I gave you gifts. They're all dead. Now I'm confessing. We did it. We did it. Please, please, please stop the plague, okay? And he's just using every possible thing. Right, I'm now pleading my case concerning the plague to the storm god, my lord. So again, this is an interesting prayer because it's an argument. It's almost not a prayer, right? He does. Here we have something that reads a little bit more like a prayer. O gods, my lord, since earliest times you have been concerned with humans, and you have not abandoned humankind. You have rather very much safeguarded humankind. Your divine servants were numerous, and they set out for the gods, my lords, offering bread and libation. Now here, this is where it turns from prayer to an explanation. But now you have turned on humankind, so that it happened that in the time of my grandfather, Hatti was oppressed. It was devastated by the enemy. Then humankind was diminished by the plague. Your divine servants were reduced in number. Okay, so here, I love this. I love this stuff. Okay, so he's like, okay, I gave you gifts. All right, you say you sinned, confess the sin. I gave you gifts. Please stop it. And now he's trying, guys, you had lots of servants. You had lots of people to bring you sacrifices. Now there's a plague. You've got a lot less servants. Stop the plague. Right? So he's using all these arguments. It's a great example of prayer, right? He's speaking to the gods. On the other hand, what he's really doing is he's trying to argue with them, saying, look, whatever you wanted, I did. Any argument that I could possibly have, please stop the plague. So that's another example of a classic. And again, one of the things that we actually usually bring these in context of is Avram's argument with God over Sodom, where there's a negotiation, right? You wouldn't do this, would you? I mean, this doesn't make sense, does it? Now, Avram's a little bit more kind of chutzpahdik, right? These guys are a little bit more like, I mean, it's very clear. They're suffering from a plague. They've got the short end of the stick. They don't have a lot of choice with what's going on. And they're just asking again and again and again for help. Here we have an interesting incantation. I know we don't have a lot of time. I will try and make this short. Let me share my screen. Okay, so here, this is an interesting incantation because it's together with purifying a house. If anyone who was in Shul this week and read Tezria Mitzorah, we know how do you cleanse a house. This is a situation where there are it's uncleanness, but what he's doing is a combination of a ritual and a prayer. Okay, so he digs. Stop that. And he digs, and then he and then he says, "Oh, sun goddess of the earth, we are taking this matter. Why is this house gasping? Why does it look upward to heaven? Either a human has perjured himself, or he's shed blood and has turned up his garment to these houses, or someone has made a threat, or someone has spoken a curse, or someone having shed blood or having committed perjury has entered." Right? All these possible reasons. Okay, and then he says, "I, a human being, have now come. As Chana takes children from the riverbank, and I, a human being, have come to summon the primordial deities of the riverbank. Let the sun goddess of the earth open the gate, and let the primordial deities and the sun goddess of the earth up from the underworld." Right? And then what he's saying, this is essentially an incantation. Again, here again, on the one hand, he's kind of talking to them, but not really. What he's really doing is he's doing a ceremony, which is trying to bring certain gods into to help him through this ceremony. This is kind of the basics of an incantation. And the idea of an incantation is that you are somehow kind of reaching up and controlling things, okay? And then he can say, "May good enter the house. May it seek out the evil with its eyes and cast it out." The idea is that he's done a ritual to kind of force the hands of these minor deities, right? Right? "Oh, Anunnaki deities, I have invoked you in this matter. So decide the case of this house." Right? "What evil blood is present, you take it and give it to the god of blood." In other words, I've summoned you. Now, you Anunnaki deities, this is what you need to do. And this is going to cleanse the house. Okay. So here we are. We're still in Hatti. And now we are going to go to Ugarit. Okay. Ugarit, again, as we know, is the closest area to kind of biblical Canaan. Right? It's earlier. But it's close. Here we have a Ugaritic prayer for a city under siege, and you can see right away that it's together with a ritual. Again, this is not a prayer that exists alone. It exists with a ritual. Okay, so here we have a ritual, here we have a festival, and then we have the prayer. "When a strong foe attacks your gate, a warrior your walls, you shall lift your eyes to Baal," right, Baal, "and say, oh," right, and say to Baal, "If you drive the strong one from our gate, the warrior from our walls, a bull we shall sanctify," right? "O Baal, we shall sanctify. Thou, O Baal, we shall fulfill. A firstborn Baal we shall sanctify. A chataf offering we shall fulfill." So you're essentially, "To the sanctuary we shall ascend. That path, O Baal, we shall take, and Baal will hear your prayer. He will drive the strong foe from your gate, the warrior from your walls." What's interesting here is, of course, that there is no such thing as just a prayer. You have to have a prayer that promises a sacrifice. Now, I have to say that there is an Egyptian prayer for kind of a personal prayer that's going to help you in a court case. And it reads very much just like almost a spontaneous prayer, saying, "Please help me win this court case. Please help me. Court case don't help the rich against the poor. Please help me win this court case." And it's not, it's a very straightforward thing. But here, what we're seeing is a lot of prayers that are connected to, this is what you do for the gods. This is what you can do for the gods, right? Finally, oh, by the way, this really bugs me. This is we're looking in the context of scripture. And right after an Ugaritic text, he brings something from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like the time difference is unbelievable. And without noting it, like most people don't read these introductions. They just skip ahead. They're not going to say, "Oh, wow, this is an unbelievable difference. You're talking about thousands of years difference. Like, that's ridiculous." Anyway, whatever. Let's move right along. Here's Ugaritic incantation against sorcery. So again, here we have this kind of thin line between prayer and incantation, right? "Baal shall drive off the young man's accuser, the affliction of your staff, rapiu. Baal, the affliction of your staff," right? "So you shall depart before the voice of the incantation priest." So what is this? He's not praying to Baal. He's trying to invoke Baal, right? For Baal to help him. Okay, and that's kind of the difference between a prayer and an incantation, right? Then Choron shall expel the sorcerer accuser, or Choron, the magician, and Galmu, the familiar, right? So you're trying to use forces, kind of not, it's not really supposed to be without their consent, but essentially it's you're kind of reaching up and changing them. And here finally we have a Babylonian prayer to Marduk. Okay. And again, here we can see how even within polytheism, frequently, now there are prayers that address more than one God, 100%, right? And here we're going to see here, and this is one of them, right? We're going to bring in other gods. Erua, Sarpanitu, Nabu, Tashmetu, right? Nergal, right? But the main thing is Marduk, right? Because Marduk is the god of Babylonia, a warrior Marduk, whose anger is a deluge, whose relenting is that of a merciful father. I am left anxious by speech unheeded. My hopes are deceived by outcry unanswered, such as has sapped my courage and hunched me over like an aged man. O great Lord Marduk, merciful Lord, men by whatever name, what can they understand by their own efforts? Who has not been negligent? Which one has committed no sin? Who can understand a God's behavior? I would fain be obedient and incur no sin. Yes, I would frequent the haunts of health. Men are commanded by the gods to act under curse. Divine affliction is for mankind to bear. And you kind of like pick a side, like what's going on here? So what's going on here is, and this is what we see here. I am surely responsible for some neglect of you. I have surely trespassed the limit set by the God. Forget what I did in my youth, whatever it was. Let your heart not well up against me. What's going on here is this. What's going on here is bad things are happening to this guy. So he's like, I must have sinned somehow. Who can understand the gods? Who knows how I sinned? God, forgive me, right? Now, it's very interesting because you don't, in general, in like the Psalms and in in prayer in the Bible, again, except for Job, right? Except for Eo, you don't have this idea of how would I possibly know what I did, right? You do have some things of like, oh yeah, I was kind of born in sin. You do have like, but the idea is that you know what your sin was. You say, I have sinned, you know what your sin was. Okay, that's an important factor. It reminds me a little bit about what I read a legal anthropology book on the Eskimos, right? And I have to say, it was a book. It was a book before the political correctness. I think it was from like the 60s. So you take it with a bit of a grain of salt, but it was talking about Eskimos in the 20s when Eskimos were, still pretty with Eskimos deep in, the hinterland, I guess, were real Eskimos. They kept Eskimo culture, and they had this thing where there were a million taboos, like just a million taboos, like you can't comb your hair under a full moon, like just a ton of these things, right? So if something bad happened to someone, they knew that they had broken one of the taboos because there were so many of them, right? And what they would do is everyone would kind of form a circle around them, and she'd be like, oh, I have, combed my hair under the full moon, and they'd be like, oh, forgive her, right? Like that. And that's what she would do. She would kind of say all the taboos she had broken, and I'm calling them taboos, but they weren't considered very serious taboos, right? They were just considered like there were so many of them that she must have broken some of them, and that made it kind of easier. When you don't know what you've done, then you kind of don't really have to. It's repentance is not like a thing because you don't know what you've done, and what you've done is really very minor. I do want to say that what could get you in trouble for Eskimos was, I guess I should say Inuit, but I don't even know if they're all Inuit. I don't know what the rules are, but what could get you in trouble was, for example, and I've mentioned this before, there was a girl who was eating bison meat with seal meat, and they said to her, and the bison were staying away, and they're like, you are offending the bison. You're eating bison with seal meat. You're offending the bison. Stop eating bison meat together with seal meat. And she didn't stop, and they threw her out. They actually threw her out of the community, which essentially meant death because there was no way to live outside of the community. And so there were rules that you could not break, right? But the things that they call taboos were essentially functioning as a way to explain bad things happening without people feeling guilty. You're like, bad things happen because you broke these taboos, but now forgive her for making these taboos, because these little taboos really don't mean much. So that's how they were kind of functioning, which is always interesting. This is why legal anthropology exists, to see what are the actual rules that they don't let people break. What are the actual laws, and what are the laws, right? Okay, coming back. Sorry, I just love talking about Eskimos. The idea here is, I don't know what I did. I don't know what I did, and who can understand the gods? Clearly, I did something. Please forgive me. Okay, and that's different from a lot of biblical and Israelite prayer. The preferred term is Inuit. Is the preferred term Inuit for all of them, for everyone, for all the groups? It's not just certain tribes are Inuit? All of them? Okay, so my apologies. My apologies for calling them Eskimos. It's something left over from my childhood. I will be better, and I will call them Inuit. Okay, sorry. All right. So yeah, she didn't know she needed a new fork and plate between fish and meat. How true? How true? The fork between fish and meat is supposed to be a health thing. You knew that? It's supposed to be like for our health. So it's like, okay, anyway, so yeah, so what have we seen? Okay, we've kind of done this very, very quick and very broad look at different types of prayer. So again, we've seen there's personal prayer, there's prayer that's kind of written as a poem, as a like a psalm, right? There are incantations where you're trying to kind of reach up and fiddle things around. And if you think about an Ov and a Yidoni in the Bible, it's like that, right? Where you're kind of trying to do something, so you find out something about the future by fiddling with stuff that's supposed to control something up above, right? And you're not allowed to do it. So we found certain similarities and certain differences. We found certain similarities that true when we're talking, and as Donnie said, this is perhaps less found in biblical prayer, but the idea that if you're going to praise God through nature, right? So there's certain similarities with what the imagery people use. The difference being, of course, that in Brachinosis, in the Psalm 104, it's not sun-centered, right? And it's specific, and it starts real. If in terms of the day cycle, it starts with the night, possibly for that reason, to say we're not centered on the sun here. We're starting with the night, and the night also has a purpose, right? We saw that in biblical narrative, biblical characters speak spontaneous prayer according to their kind of personalities and circumstances. And we can see this very much in the difference between Yaakov and Shimshon, where each one is speaking from their their needs, and also in a way, it's kind of their relationship with God, where Yaakov has this kind of, and it's interesting, different characters, by the way, have different relationships with God. On the one hand, there is this idea, as Moshe Greenberg said, that anyone can pray. And on the other, if you compare, for example, David and Shaul, David can always turn to God. It seems like he's got God on speed dial. Shaul can't talk to God unless he has someone next to him who can reach God, right? So that's also always very interesting. But so we saw that there are absolutely differences, and at the same time that there is this kind of slide, even in polytheistic societies, towards kind of a monotheistic prayer mode sometimes, where they want to address the most powerful God or the most relevant God, and they want to speak to that God, right? And we saw that there are also ideas of, I sinned, and that's why you're punishing me, or I need to repent, or please forgive me, or but we also see that there's a lot of pairing. And the truth is, Yaakov also pairs it with kind of sacrifices. But in ancient Near Eastern prayer, there's a lot of pairing it with sacrifices. There's a lot of pairing it with ritual, right? And we saw that, at least on the part of the Hatti kings, there's when they're in trouble with a plague, there's a lot of bargaining. There's a lot of bargaining to try and convince the gods to help them out. much more bargaining than we would normally expect to see in prayer, but that we do see between Avram and God in Breshit in Genesis to save stone. So I hope there's of course a lot more to say about prayer. I hope if people enjoyed this little taste of different types of ancient Near Eastern prayer, incantation, etc., and looking at certain biblical parallels. And thank you for joining me.